Good evening, everybody. Thank you all very much for being here. And we are very pleased to welcome you to the John G. Winslow Lecture, which is our last lecture of the summer series. This annual lecture has been named in tribute to the legacy of John Grenville Winslow, who served as the president of the Preservation Society's board from 1977 to 1989. Anyone who remembers who of you knew John Winslow? Because you know that he was just incredibly interested in history, very knowledgeable. He knew the history of Newport, the history of Newport families, and he knew every single house in this neighborhood. If you ever were invited on a tour of the neighborhood with him, you could expect to be out in his car for at least 4 to 5 hours. He played a huge role in growing this organization in the late 70s and all through the 80s. And he stayed very active with the Preservation Society until he died at the age of 93 in 2011. And I know that Mr. Winslow and his wife, Helen, who was equally active with the Preservation Society, would be very pleased with tonight's lecture, and they would have loved to have known you, Bob Shaw. This year, we have brought, I think, a number of really exciting lectures to all of you, the audience, both in person and by Zoom. And we are very grateful for the support that you've given us in the last months. We are just now in the process of finalizing our fall lecture series, so stay tuned. We will soon be announcing the dates, the lectures, the subjects, all very exciting. Tonight's lecture will involve people on Zoom. There are more than 1,600 of you, which, Bob, are you nervous? And we even sent the link to Lord Fellows in case he's interested in watching. Really makes it good, right, Bob? And more than 500 of you signed up for tonight's lecture. We know that there aren't that many because there is somewhat of a fall off, but that's okay. The room is filled. We will be circulating through the audience at the end of the lecture. Leslie Jones, our Director of Museum Affairs, will be with a microphone. So for those of you who want to ask a question, please feel free to do so. And now it is my great honor to introduce our speaker, Bob Shaw. We got, you can come up here if you want. We were very fortunate to meet Bob very early in the development of the production of the TV series, The Gilded Age. And we learned very quickly that Bob is a phenomenal historian, as well as being a very creative and accomplished artist. All you have to do is watch The Gilded Age, and all of those special details, those incredible touches, they are Bob Shaw's. And it's true. And while we love him for what he created in The Gilded Age, I do want to talk a little bit about his career because it's very impressive. He is an Academy Award nominated art director and production designer, well known for his work in The Irishman, starring Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci from 2019, The Wolf of Wall Street, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, 2013, both of which were directed by Martin Scorsese, and all of his work spanning 7 years of The Sopranos from 2000 to 2007. Bob Shaw. His career in film, television, and theater spans 30 years and includes winning 2 Emmys for his work on, this is Julian Fellows' favorite program, Mad Men in 2008, and an Emmy for Boardwalk Empire in 2011. Just recently, Bob was nominated for another Emmy, this time for Outstanding Production Design for a narrative period or fantasy program for his work as part of The Gilded Age, the TV series. And the episode that is mentioned in the nomination is the very first episode of the show. And we love this line. never the new. We hope that wins. It is clear that Bob is a master in understanding how important scenery is to storytelling, and we are honored that he believed that our Newport mansions were the kinds of scenery that the new HBO show, The Gilded Age, needed to bring Julian Fellowes' story to life. Now, many of you know that Lord Fellowes was here several weeks ago. Of course, he and Bob work very closely together. He spoke very well of you, by the way. He admires you greatly. And I want to tell you, he wrote two notes of thanks. And I want to read just one paragraph from one note. He says, I must say, I do love the enthusiasm of your guests for the show and also for Downton. It is flattering. This is Julian Fellowes saying, it is flattering. It is flattering and rewarding and generally a great treat. But in truth, I feel a sort of kinship to Newport and its people, past and present. And this week I have been able to indulge that and to enjoy it. So we are delighted that the second season of The Gilded Age is in the works, and some of it has been filmed and will be filmed here in October in our houses. We can't wait to learn when the second season will debut, but everybody is being very numb on that. Maybe we can get that out of you, Bob. But most of all, we are rooting for you, Bob, to win that Emmy Award. So please welcome Bob Shaw to the program.
I'd be lying if I didn't say we're nervous. What I really want to do is sort of explain a little bit about the process of how we make the decisions we make. And everyone here, I'm sure, is some kind of history buff. And you look at these shows and you say, well, why did they do that? Or that's not right. And you know, there's a process that you're serving history, you're serving the story, you're serving, you know, a larger list of concerns than just making historical document. So I always think of my father, who went to the movie, saw the movie Bugsy, and it was set in 1940. And he said, right in the front, there was a 1941 car. Do they think people are idiots? Because he's a car enthusiast, and it was all about the cars to him. So I'm just going to try to give you a little bit of the decision-making process and how we arrived with the show. And I'll see if I can advance slides competently or not. Okay, I'm going to start with the Fifth Avenue. The story is really the story of the old money versus the new money in New York. And the Van Ryn family, the Brook family, are on one side of the street in their brownstone, and they're assaulted by the Russell family, who has the effrontery to build this gigantic mansion right across the street from them. And the first thing we had to do was sort of lay out this set that was based on the relationship between the two houses. So on the left of the side is the giant Russell mansion, and somewhere where the brownstone stoops are is the Brook mansion. That's our first historical inaccuracy, because our story has the brownstone having been there like for 30 years or more, and they weren't really building up that far north prior to actually, I guess 57th Street was when Mary Mason Jones built her marble mansions, and before that there was really not much up like there before 1870 or whatever it is. But our story required this tension between the Brook family and the Van Ryn family. No, it's the same family, the Brook family and the Russell family, and so we had to lay out our street, and that was the first thing we did, was start doing some illustrations. And there's just an embarrassment of riches, and we're trying to take a little bit from here and a little bit from there. And one of the first decisions we had to make was whether we were going to do cobblestone streets or not. And I was on the phone and going back and forth with somebody from the city of New York, who was a historian, and no one could definitively say when they started to lay cobblestones above 57th Street. So we decided that it would be a little earthier. And one of the things we tried to this shows our primary relationship, which is that's the servant in the Brook house sort of spying on what's going on in the Russell house. And so that's how we knew from the beginning we had to build a set, which is a big undertaking to do you know, a mansion and several brownstones and streets but there was no way we were going to find some place that was a practical location, certainly in New York City, that was going to let us close the streets for many weeks at a time, cover the streets with dirt, bring a lot of horses, remove the street lamps, and it just didn't even seem like something we could consider. So we knew we had to build a back lot set. So we started. Now, when I first met Julian Fellows, he said, "I really quite adore the Duke Mansion, and this is the Duke Mansion." And I thought, I'm just starting this process, and the Duke Mansion was built in 1910, and we're and we're supposed to be in 1882. So I'm going to have to sort of finesse this somehow. And then I met with Michael Engler, who was our primary director, and I was saying, well, you know that Bertha Russell is clearly meant to be Alva Vanderbilt, and Alva Vanderbilt had the Petit Chateau, which looked like this. And he said, "I don't want any turrets." And so I already knew that we had a love for a house that was too late, and we didn't like turrets. And I had rather had my heart set on doing some turrets. But I had to put them aside. And then we also had a discussion, which was, well, if the carriages just pull up to the curb, it's going to be awkward. Can we set the street back, set the house back from the street? And it's like, well, yes, the Carnegie Mansion. I keep having to find, you know, any one example to say, yes, I can do this because they did this here. Yes, I can do this because they did that there. So the Carnegie Mansion, which was built in the 1890s, gave us permission to set ourselves back from the street and have this little place for the carriages to turn around. Now, we had many discussions about how the up above 57th Street in Manhattan wasn't very developed. And so this was one of the pictures. It's actually labeled in my files, the picture, because it was one we kept going back to, and we kept saying, well, it wasn't built up, and maybe we'll have a lot of area that's rough and undeveloped. And then we realized that the entire world would have to be computer generated, because if you look, there was never a building to stop your eye. There was a building here and there was a building there. So even though this was sort of our aesthetic that we started with, we had to throw that aside. And you can see how many vacant lots we decided we could have. 2. We, you know, start working with a team of people. Some people are working in 3D. You know, I'm doing floor plans, and then they're putting them into scale, starting with how long the block was, how wide the streets were, the sidewalks were wider, and all these different considerations. And then someone puts it in 3D, and we start from there. So these were the earliest visualizations of the set, and you can see that some of these buildings were actually, we found them somewhere in a book, and we just copied them and stuck them there, and we had placeholders. And this was a presentation I had to do for HBO and for Lord Fellows, to say, this is the Russell House, and this is where we decided later that we were going to be on 61st Street. So that's, you know, an earlier thing. And we just started laying this out. Oh, here we go. So we did this rough, just approximation of what it would look like, and it's missing something. And so the scenic artist who paints all our marble, I would say that if marbling were an Olympic event, Pat Sprott's team would win the gold. And we made an appointment to meet on the east side, and we were going to look at what the stone looked like up close, and sort of analyze the you know, different things. And we were so enthusiastic that we met at 6:30, and it was still dark. So we had to go for a coffee while we decided what we were doing. And then we happened upon the Sloan Mansion, which is still intact. And we said, okay, well, this will look much better with some columns. And so we copied the columns. You will be learning during the course of this talk that I freely borrow from other people's work. So we basically decided that our house would look great with these. And this is another house that's a little bit later. Now, interestingly, so this is the beginning of starting to build our Russell House. And we had long discussions of, are we really going to build it that tall? And we were going to build 2 stories, then we were going to build 1 story, then we were going to build 3 stories. And eventually we made a giant model of the whole thing. And it's hard to tell here, but the parts that are darker are the parts that we actually built physically. And all the stuff that's sort of ghosty and faint was going to be done with the computer. So when you see the actual set, that's how much of the Russell House is real. And yeah. And yeah, the visual effects team does amazing work. And what's changed a lot during the course of my career is now people when we did Boardwalk Empire, we built a certain amount, and then we did pencil sketches and handed them to the visual effects department and said, well, you can work with this. Now we have people in the art department who are doing 3D versions of everything. And we say, here, plunk this building here and put this building there. And even after we had wrapped for the season, I was still getting notes from the visual effects people saying, we can't quite tell what this is. Could you show us what this piece of ornament is? And so I was always having to, have my reference at hand and call people and tell them what was missing. But it's kind of crazy. It was a very expensive undertaking, and as impressive as it is, and as big as it is, we kind of got there that that's all there is. Because so much of it is generated on the computer. This is what I referred to earlier. This was Mary Mason Jones' houses, and she inherited some property from her husband. It took her 20 years after he died to sort of get access to the money, and he had this property up on 57th Street that he had purchased a long time earlier. Mary Mason Jones is the aunt of Edith Wharton. So the character in Age of Innocence, for those who are familiar, Mrs. Mingott, is based on Mary Mason Jones. And famously, it says that she built her house and patiently waited for society to come up to her. So she was waiting in 1870. And by the time we get to 1882, the Russells and the Brooks had joined her. And there are all sorts of funny little considerations you wouldn't know. So brownstones go front to back and usually have windows in the front and the back and nothing in between. And the director of photography, who's responsible for lighting the set, is like, don't do that to me. I can't light only from the front. Isn't there any way to give us some side light? And then, like I said, always looking for permission from something historic to allow us to take license. So the Brook have a garden on the side of their house, which lets them have 2 windows on the side so they can have side light instead of just front and back light. And this is the Rockefeller House, which is now where I think it's where the sculpture garden for the Museum of Modern Art is. And so this gave us permission to do that. And this was the early visualization. And you can see there's a little gap between the houses on the right side. And I had to have historic license to do it. And then this again, this is how much of the houses really exist. And from my mind, if we were going to say that Agnes Van Ryn's husband had built these houses, he would have done what Mary Mason Jones did and build a block of them. So we have 5 houses that are more or less similar, although the Brooks house is just a little bit nicer, because if they were going to move that far uptown, they weren't going to be alone. And so that we built a block of houses. And this is the level of detail of what we actually built. And there were people carving and coating foam, and we have amazing artisans at our who work with us, and that we're incredibly dependent upon. But again, we had drawn more of this house, and they decided, since it was the other end of the block, we had to conserve a little bit. So these houses, we have the doors there just so people can enter and exit, but they're entering and exiting a house that doesn't really exist. This was one of my favorite parts of the set, and because we kept referring to it as the moat. I don't know what architecturally we should really call it, but most houses, had a setback from the street. And then we realized as we were building it that it was just tall enough for us to put a staircase there. And so that's where the servants, come and go. And what's kind of interesting is it's made to be a duplicate. We're missing a transom because we weren't quite tall enough. But the door that you see on the right side is sort of a duplicate to the door of the Elms, because we have been shooting the Elms kitchen to be the Russell kitchen. And they sort of match if you don't look too closely. And now, of course, you're all going to look too closely. So the house across the street, the Brook house, had another interesting sort of genesis. It originally, the characters were from the South. And I had been doing my research, and it's like, well, it wasn't really popular to do stained woodwork in houses apparently prior to the 1870s. And it's like, well, they're from the South, and so the woodwork can be painted. And I remember the Salmagundi. Actually, this was a rendering that probably you'll see as I show you some other renderings that this looks the least like the final set than any of our renderings. So I'm going to move on. I had the Salmagundi Club in mind. It's the last of the townhouses, the brownstones from the 1850s that are still on the avenue in Fifth Avenue. And it's from the 1850s. I forget the exact year, but the columns that eventually became part of the Brook House set were sort of inspired by this. And then I went to the Merchant House. That this is actually still detail in the Salmagundi Club, and you'll see later that we pilfered that as well. And then I went to the Merchant House, which is on 3rd Street in New York City, and that was the first time that it occurred to me that they should have carpeting on their floor, because we started the early versions and there was wood, and we were talking about how many carpets we were going to need, and then I found, at the Merchant House that we just had to have this the carpeting. But then the script was revised and the sisters were no longer from the South. And so we did a version and all these renderings of the painted woodwork, and everyone thought, well, it just doesn't look as rich and old. So we started putting the set together, and this is where we eventually landed. And I was explaining to someone just earlier that we had to stop somewhere, because the amount of detail, the amount of pattern, the carpet being one pattern, the wallpaper being another pattern, the furniture having a different upholstery. At a certain point, it just became too much for contemporary eyes to take in. And we thought, if there's all this accurate level of bric-a-brac, it would almost be too much for people to watch. We went through a whole period where we had mantle scarves and extra layers. And at a certain point, we started to pull back for this particular house because we're going to see it so much. And it's funny, of all the big houses that the big things we built and the amount of work we did, this one is sort of my favorite, because I feel the most like the family you live. You get the sense of the family living there. And because it's warmer, it's darker, and you hopefully get the sense they've lived there for a while. And I guess the Russell house was really never meant to be that inviting. For example, we had several of these rope portieres made, and we hung them, and having more than one, again, just made our eyes cross. So we pulled back. That's one of the problems of doing what I do. It's very hard to document your work, because we're dressing and we're painting and we're putting up wallpaper, and then when we just about finished, the lighting crew comes in and they push everything to the side and they drop the ceilings and they start hanging all this stuff. And so I very rarely have pictures of anything when it's complete. So these are the last stages of dressing, and so that's the crew, obviously during COVID, with their masks. And that's our brilliant decorator leaning against the wall, probably looking at her to-do list on her phone. And my favorite thing of the process is picking fabrics and picking wallpaper and picking the elements. And sometimes people will do that first and say, this is going to be the color scheme for this room. This is going to be the color scheme for that room. I always like to start picking the fabric and letting that lead the way, and not trying to enforce a color scheme on the decorator, because when you get too specific, as much as you like to have your own creativity, you have to allow that for the people who are working on the show. And for me to be too specific too early is going to keep Regina from doing her particular magic. And she's really one of the best people in the business. It's the people who work with her know. When we were doing this, I was picking the wallpaper and we were pinning it on the board. I always make a joke and call it the Selectron chamber. And Regina and I would spend many hours late at night pinning fabrics on the wall and pinning wallpaper on the wall. And I act like we're auditioning, like we're doing the cast, and something will be on the wall for a while, and then I'll take it down and say, thank you for coming. And it gets cut, but we'll remember you, because sometimes we'll use it later. And something wasn't right because we had wallpaper in the front, we had wallpaper in the middle, and we had wallpaper in all three rooms. And I thought that my own eyes were starting to get tired from looking at it. And we happened to have gone down to Philadelphia to scout the Academy of Music as a possible location for season one, which didn't come to be because we used the music hall in Troy. And I remember that when we were there was this painted treatment on the corridors. And I thought, oh, great, I can take that and we can put it in the middle parlor to give us a little break from the wallpaper. So that's a different color scheme using something that was, so basically the idea is you have to have a good memory and you have to have some sort of mental filing system and say, wait, it's missing something. What about what we saw in Philadelphia? I think it might have been when I was on one of my early trips to here, and I don't to Newport, where I saw the encaustic tile. And sometimes we'll paint tile, and sometimes we'll print tile. And for this show, it's like, no, we have to have the real thing. And it's one of my favorite parts of the set because I just love that tile. I wish I had more rooms to tile. And here you see, this is the rope trim on the casing that was borrowed from the Salmagundi Club and stained. But since so much of the materials we use to make the woodwork aren't wood, they're castings, they're resins, they're plastic. So it puts us in the position that we have to faux wood grain everything. And again, the scenic artists it's very tedious work to wood grain rope molding. And they love their craft so much that they were very excited to work on a project and to get to take out all of their skills and because if they could equally be working on a crime procedural, the people in the Scenic Artists Union, and when they get a project like this, they just latch onto it. And we're based in New York City, and one of our sets was in Long Island, a Russell House set, and we thought we were going to have a hard time getting people to travel to Long Island every day, and they did because they had the opportunity to do the marbling and the faux finishes and really use their craft. Interestingly, I think it was my first trip to the Chateau sur Mer, where I saw the stenciling in the cornices in the coves there, and obviously thought we needed to do that for the Brook House. But it was all created on the computer. And actually I'd sketched little versions of it and did little scribbles with what the colors were, and went over and over and over with our scenic artists and with actually our graphic artists and saying, well, maybe this is too light, maybe this is too dark. And eventually we printed it all on canvas and then applied it into the coves. And I love it. I wish we could do it to locations, but people really don't want us to start gluing things to their walls. And something that we did was the first time I've ever done on a show was we actually went to a stained glass studio and had real stained glass windows created in like this. And when you see how the light hits real glass, we do different kind of fake versions of it. And again, the computers changed our life. We can do a pattern and have it cut on the computer out of a thin material, and we can apply it to glass or apply it to plexiglass, and it looks like stained glass if you're not really too close to it, but real stained glass and the way it refracts light, to me, it's like just this tremendous treat to have real stained glass on our set. The kitchen is the least historically based of anything in the show because people didn't really tend to photograph the kitchens of their brownstones. We found that this was a rendering that we did of the Brook House kitchen. We knew that there would be a butler's pantry. We knew that there would be the main room with the stove. We had to invent a room for the servants to gather, which is what you're seeing beyond. But I couldn't, there were literally like only 4 or 5 photos I found of kitchens and brownstones. And we duplicated this little setup almost completely. But I was fortunate on my first trip to Newport to be taken to the basement of the Chateau sur Mer. And I love the tile and the diagonal pattern on the cabinets. And I love the fact that this had tile, and the kitchen in our brownstone historically might have had tile, but we felt that we were going to have tile in the Russell House. And sometimes we make decisions not based on accuracy, but based on contrast. So we felt that we needed a different texture and a different look for the brownstone for the Brook House. So we decided not to do the tile, although I love the tile and felt very, very fortunate to get a chance to see something that's not always on view. So you can see, if you look at the diagonal pattern, and this is the kitchen before it was fully dressed. So there's our tile borrowed from the chateau, and the same thing, the cabinets are influenced by the chateau. And then this is the cast rehearsing. I think we're not, because you can see someone still having their makeup touched up. And these are screen grabs that I don't know that I'm allowed to be showing, but I am. And but we were pretty happy that it ultimately didn't stray that much from the original rendering. Because often the rendering will have different colors. I'll start painting it and I'll go, oh, that's a mistake. And but this one kind of fell into place. And we did the brick texture on the walls for a while. We were leaving it as natural brick, and then we decided that that was too much visual information, so we painted the brick. And there's your Chateau sur Mer cabinets, for which we're very grateful to borrow. And this is the area that we needed a place for the servants to gather. And a friend of mine who has a brownstone, the third owner of it, said that most of the center of the kitchen floor level was cabinetry, and there were a couple bedrooms in the front. Our cook, because our story, the female servants are on the top floor and the men are on the ground floor. And I think the historical truth is that the cook would be on the ground floor, because the cook had to get up early and light the oven if anyone was going to eat. And we kind of fictionalized this gathering place just to serve the story. Then we come to the Russell House, which I call it Newport's greatest hits. And this was the initial rendering. The initial rendering was going on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And sometimes you do everything at once. And in this case, we had an incredibly skilled illustrator, because people think this is a photograph all the time. And it's a rendering. And he was working with our lead set designer on this show, who's now our art director, Larry Brown, was drawing this. And as he was drawing it, he would go and say, "This is what the fireplace looks like," and take it to the illustrator, and he would put it in. And then we would change textures. So the fireplace is a little influenced by the dining room of the Breakers. And one of the interesting things, or not interesting, is that once we got a certain point in production, and we realized that my first time I interviewed with the production company, I said, now I would recommend that unless you plan on having a ball every episode, don't build a ballroom. There are plenty of beautiful mansions that have ballrooms, and we'll film in one of those. And that was part of what began the trip to Newport, was to say, well, there's some mansions there. And so we started that process. But by being visually tied into some of the Newport mansions, it sort of pushed us a little later historically, because, oh, here we go back to the Duke Mansion. And so all I did was basically use the proportions of the Duke Mansion and then change all of the details. Because one of the things that I noticed first was that it's not a great entrance. You come kind of around a blind corner, and maybe they'll see your elbow first or your wrist or something. And so made a point of trying to have this upper landing, which I really didn't find in any houses. But since we were somewhat tied to Stanford White in the script, I thought, well, I can use something that's in the Metropolitan Club. I mean, it's not a house, but it has this landing. And so that was, how that decision came about, because I was trying to create a better entrance. So even though it might not be something you're going to see in most homes, it was something that I felt was going to work for the show. Every time Bertha appears at the top of the stairs, you can see her head to toe instead of just getting her piecemeal. And so this is the Duke Mansion, which I felt was far too restrained for our exuberant story. And this brings us back to Alva. And at the time the Petit Chateau was being built, most of the balustrades in the houses were stone. And I thought it's very impressive. It would make a great production of Ivanhoe, but that, it wasn't going to have the elegance that we were looking for the Russells. So we pushed them a little bit more toward the 1890s, when the steel balustrades became more popular, which enabled, our Russell House to shake hands with Newport and start, looking like we were all part of the same place. And something I don't have pictures of, when we started touring Newport, we went to the Breakers and we walked into the billiard room and went, what scene are we going to put in here? And originally there was a scene where Mr. Morris comes to speak to Mr. Russell, and they're in his library. And it's like, well, wouldn't it be better if they were in the billiard room? And that was the first room we decided, I can't even tell you where in the Russell house this billiard room would be. And people say, well, a director will come in and they'll start saying, so now where do you think the billiard room is? It's there. Because, most people, actually a lot of people do pick up on those things, and people ask these questions all the time. And I always say to people, unfortunately, if you're looking for inaccuracies, if you're looking for things that don't quite track, have at it. I'm guilty, but you can see how, for the elegance of Bertha coming down the stairs, it's just not the same with this heavy stone and the look that would have been appropriate to the Petit Chateau. So then this is our photos of our final set, not fully dressed, because as I explained, I never get in there before they start lighting and doing all the stuff. But I was pretty pleased with how our rendering, turned into our final piece. And other borrowings. So one of the things we needed was in the entrance, which is, I guess I have a photograph of that later. It would be more normal to have the iron gates on the outside of the house, and then the wooden gates on the inside, of the wooden doors on the inside of the vestibule. But then whenever the doors were closed, we wouldn't have that little bit of extra depth. The directors of photography and the directors are always looking for the shot to be deeper. If there's a door, it's like, can I open it and see what's in the next room? And then sometimes when we haven't dressed the next room, I say no. And then they say, please. And then I say, well, maybe we can put a piece of a drape and a piece of furniture there. But I wanted to have the iron gates on the outside and the wooden gates on the inside. And I was driving home from work one day and passed by the Lotus Club and went, I'm allowed to do it, because they did that for the Lotus Club. And then we did this for our Russell house. So inside the Great Hall are these doors, and then the wooden doors that look suspiciously similar to the ones at the Lotus Club are on the outside. And that's our art director, Laura Ballinger Gardner, who could have been an excellent air traffic controller. But this again is how modern technology helps us so much, because all of this, what appears to be ironwork, is computer cut. One of our set designers did the file digitally on the computer, and then we send it out to a place, and it was cut in sinter, which is a plastic material, laminated certain pieces together. And again, Larry, who worked on this set, would, I would come back from scouting, and he would say, what about this? What about that? And it drove him crazy, because I would say, yeah, it's not curvy enough, or it's not this, or it's not that. And so, to spend all day working on these things and then have someone breeze in at the end of the day and say, can you find something curvier? I'm sure it was very frustrating, and he did an amazing job. And he was not part of the crew that came to Newport the first season. And so this season, when we were filming our first round here, and he obviously was very proud of his doors, and it's like, now let me show you the marble house. And I said, yeah, it's amazing that our doors look kind of small now, don't they? Because they're just magnificent. And I showed this picture of the in the decorating department, someone's responsible almost for doing nothing but shopping for hardware. And when you show them the hardware, the door pulls on the giant doors at Marble House, it's like, I don't think I'm going to find those anywhere. And I forget what we ended up as a solution, but it's a difficult thing. And this was my case for our scenic artists winning the Marble Olympics, because this is all painted. And this actually, I think, is mostly made of metal. This was the process of working on the ceiling. It was so big that we did the ceiling first, and it looked like a giant spaceship. And all the scenic artists were painting it on the ground, just a few inches above their heads. So you can see we did this, the ceiling's almost completely finished, and the rest of the house isn't done, because once we got the rest of it built, there was no way we were going to even get up there to work on the ceiling. And now this is our dining room. And I think when I first toured the breakers, I fell in love with the columns and the sconces that were on the columns in the music room at the breakers. And it was like, well, that would look really great in the dining room. And so we laid it out and we did that. And you can see these are the actual, okay, so yours are nicer. We did the best we could, but that's where that influence came. And so we applied them to our dining room. Now, an interesting thing here again, this table, the surface is printed. It's printed, and then one of our scenic artists was a former piano finisher, and he put this piano finish on it. Something I forgot to mention, I'm going to go backwards. Does anyone recognize this floor? We photographed the floor of Marble House. And that was printed and then heavily sealed in order to have a marble surface on it. But the floor is also photographic. No, it's actually printed on masonite. It's amazing the things you can do. And it's amazing that I know people who know enough to do them, because I'm not as up on some of the latest technologies as some of the other people in the art department are. So this is our printed table. That's where I left off. And the drawing room, I've toured so many historic homes, and almost every one of them has a French style drawing room. And so we knew we were going to do that. And I mean, I think this is Cornelius Vanderbilt's house, but that's just an example of, again, more elaborate than our house. But it was just one of those things that I felt would be part of the complete home. And one of the other things that you'll notice at the over the fireplace there is a portrait of Bertha Russell. And I thought, well, maybe we can make a stab at doing our own Baldini. This is one of those things where, to me, the room works because of the carpet. Regina found this amazing carpet, and it really pulls the room together. I can't really imagine it without the carpet. And I almost had to, because there was a leak while we were off, and it leaked right onto the carpet. And I said, when I went to look at the set, I said, oh, well, fortunately, this didn't get too damaged. And they said, you didn't see it before we sent it out. And I would have been just bereft if this carpet were no longer part of the set, because the way, the red tones work in the room. And one of the other things touring historic homes that I absolutely wanted was a decorative piano. So this piano, when Regina purchased it for us to decorate, had just come back from the refinishers. And it was all walnut. And it was like the scenic artists were almost saying, don't make me do it. Are you sure you want us to do this? And it's like, we have to have a gold piano. So one of our scenic artists was had a previous career of her own company that did decorative painting, and she did all the hand painting on the sides of the piano, and then on both the top of the piano and on the underside of the lid, those were printed on canvas, and then we applied them. But that's the whole effect. Again, another person wearing a mask. And there is the famous painting of Elizabeth Drexel Lair, and there is our own version of Sultan of Swish, Baldini, and the actress Carrie Coon, who plays Bertha, says it is very unnerving to constantly be working in the room with this imperious portrait of yourself looking down on you. For some reason, I went through this thing early on where I was trying to avoid doing the red library, and all of the earlier renderings of the library, the velvet was green. And then, fortunately, Regina, our decorator, is somebody who I always say when I get the eyebrow or I get a slight eye roll, and she said, "Are you really sure you want to do this?" And she convinced me that, it was classic and we had to go with the classic. And sometimes you think you want to break out and do something different, and then you realize there's a reason to do what's traditional. So this was George Russell's den, and that piece over top of the this of course is a rendering and not a photograph, but a scenic artist sculpted the bronze plate above the fireplace. And some of you might be able to figure out where we were influenced for Bertha's bedroom. And but again, in the interest of historical accuracy, mauve and the purple tones were extremely popular in the 1890s. So that's when I understand that someone who was trying to synthesize quinine accidentally invented lavender dye. And so it was the latest thing in the 1890s. And they said in her later years, Queen Victoria even dressed in a very dark purple instead of black, because everyone had to have some version of this purple or this mauve. So that's why we decided, well, maybe we wouldn't be quite so the same if her room were pink. And when we did the actual room, it took 350 yards of Italian silk to make the curtains and to upholster the walls and the bedding. And that's one of those things where we like the shape of the bed, but the where the upholstery actually is with wicker. And Regina said, "I really like this bed, but I don't see us having like wicker." It's like, well, maybe we just upholster it. And again, I don't even really know the history myself, other than that everywhere we were looking, we would see this raised platform around the bed. And some of them were fairly stark, and then some of them had these elaborate pillows. And I don't remember which house it is. Maybe it's Hyde Park or Vanderbilt Mansion, and there's a rail around the bed. And I didn't really know what it was about. And Julian was, "Oh, that was something that the French did. Only the inner circle was allowed on the inside of the railing. The other servants had to stay on the outside of the railing." So it's always interesting to have, him able to just chime in and say, "Well, it's an interesting thing," and be able to give you the history. And now this is, I'm sure some of you know that we claim that Bertha's bedroom and George's bedroom are off the hallways of the second floor of the Elms. And so on our set outside of Bertha's bedroom is this hallway backing, which has the same silk fabric that's on the walls of the Elms. We went to Scalamandre, I believe it's Scalamandre, and they said, "Well, we don't make it anymore, but we can reprint some of it for you." So they actually took an old print that they weren't making anymore and recreated this for us so that we could match so on the left side here is our set, and then this is Carrie Coons as Bertha entering actually Gladys's room. That's another thing that gets a little directionally challenged, which bedrooms are where. And I'd appreciate you not trying to figure it out. And then obviously the Russell Ballroom looks an awful lot like the music room of the Breakers because it was shot in the music room of the Breakers. And so that was one of those, to me, magical nights. Every so often, you do this for years and years and years. And there are certain moments where everything sort of coalesces and, it's just magical. And the idea that after all the work we did, one of the last things we did was the ball in the Breakers and everyone in period costume in this fabulous room that we admired so much. It just all came together. Now, one thing that's funny though, is that originally we were not going to use the ballroom at the Breakers. We were using a ballroom in another mansion. And then that wasn't working out because of some COVID restrictions. And then we chose another one, and then we chose another one. And then we ended up finally one day saying, why don't we use the Breakers? And I think it was Michael Engler who said, why don't we use the Breakers? We even went through this thing that we were going to use Marble House. And then Julian came up to me and said, it was very clever to use the elements of the dining room to match the Breakers. It really tied everything together. It was very, very clever of you. And it's like, because it was a complete accident. It was way after we did the dining room, we decided to do the ballroom scenes in the Breakers. Now, here's another. So this you'll all recognize as the Kitchen of the Elms. The only things we really changed is we had to figure out how to rig something that looked like gaslight. And I sort of drew this on a plan. And when I showed it to the lead man who's responsible for hanging things like that, he was like, well, what's going to hold this up in the air? And it's like, well, maybe there's enough structure in the junction boxes that are there that we can hang. And there was just enough. And so this is us sort of bringing it to life. And we had to make our own tables because the ones with the historic zinc coverings, obviously we couldn't go near. And then we made our annunciator, which is definitely the large print size annunciator. I don't think I've ever seen anyone this large. And, but, we needed to read on camera. So that's another thing that where we cheated. Now, the interesting story here is originally we were going to build our own kitchen. And this was a plan, and it had all these hallways and this apex, and it had a separate scullery and a pantry and a servant's hall and a stairways and this elaborate backing. And it was quite large. And these are some of the earliest visualizations of that set. And then we did a budget, and it was going to cost 2.35 million. And then our producer David Crockett said, it's an awfully nice kitchen in the Elms. And then I at first said, because I really secretly wanted to build this giant kitchen with all the tile and I said, well, isn't it going to look a little older on camera? It's not going to look like the brand new Russell House. And we did some tests, and the director of photography weighed in, and the visual effects people weighed in and said they could digitally erase the conduit that was on the ceiling. And then it came out. I can't imagine us not being in the Elms now. But for a period of time, I was in mourning for wanting to build this giant kitchen. And you want to be a team player and you want to do what's best for the production, but sometimes you want to do things that you just think are fun. So the work that we do on location is a whole other matter. Someone once asked me about working on period shows. And I said, getting to build the sets on stage and getting to make the houses from scratch is just a designer's dream. And going to locations that are contemporary and trying to make them look like 1882 is a designer's nightmare. And we had a scene at the end of one of the episodes in the first season where they're all going to the big celebration of the first electrification of the New York Times building. And when I first saw this photo, I thought we can do that there. And we could put in a computer generated Times building because we were going to have the floors light up one by one. And this Canon building to the left is a department store, was a full block department store from 1838, which is, still there in Troy. And someone said what about the monument? Was there a monument like that in New York? And I said, yeah, but it was torn down in 1910, which I made up. And because I thought that it looked so great that I didn't want one little monument to get in our way. So this was the rendering of what it was going to look like when we put in the computer generated building for the first electrification. And fortunately, there were many photographs of what the Cannon building looked like back in the day. And we found little details like the dresses that were on sale that were on these blocks on the street, just sitting there. And so we did that actually because there was a sort of steward grate that we couldn't build our way around. So we put a platform over it and displayed dresses on it. But unfortunately, when we first went to the Cannon building, it looked more like this. And so we had a lot of work to do. And fortunately, the city of Troy was very welcoming and just let us do this. They let us. So this was the Cannon building in its prime. This is how we found it. And this is where we hoped to bring it. And this was a rendering that was never finished, because you'll notice the signs don't say anything. And at a certain point, we were moving on to other projects, and that never got finished. And the city of Troy let us take this entire square and cover the street with dirt for 3 weeks. And we had all sorts of conditions. The first day we put it down, it was very windy and very dry. And we thought we had recreated the Dust Bowl. And unfortunately, not that far from this area are a number of outdoor restaurants. And we thought they're going to run us out of town. And then it rained. And we had some cobblestones that we'd used for another set. And I said, quick, bring the cobblestones here. And, I remembered from research that often in these muddy streets, they would do cobblestone or Belgian block just for the crosswalk. And so, I'd forgotten it. It was a piece of research that early on was like, we have to do that. And I somehow forgot until I saw all this mud. And it's like, quick, get the cobblestones. And so we laid them out. And here's an odd little fact. So you notice that they have a rather incomplete collection of awnings on the second floor. And at a certain point, when we're above the height of most people walking, you don't need to do everything practically, and the computer can do it. But they say it's very helpful if you can give us some things to copy. So we had just enough awnings for them to then photograph them and replicate them. And the reason we did them, in more than one place is so they would have different perspectives on them, so they could just copy them and repeat them. And this is, the reality of doing television is that the building across the street that says Dewey Brothers Clothing is clearly from about 1920. And I didn't really have the option of demolishing it and or altering it in any permanent way. And so we just put a lot of signs on it, and then there were a lot of awnings. And then we hoped that I just asked them, try to frame out the top of the building, try not to feature that too much. And sometimes they could, and sometimes they couldn't. But we were very happy that Bloomingdale's was happy enough with our sign that when they were doing a display for their 150th anniversary, they asked, could they have the sign to put in part of the display. We had a whole different plan the first time we went to Troy, and we were all over the place. And then the cafe that was on the corner there closed. And we said, oh, what a shame. Can we rent it? And we decided that would be our Bloomingdale's. And so when we first found, I think I said, well, this is great. We can make this into Bloomingdale's. But it had been a jewelry store once, years and years earlier. And there was just a little bit of this cabinetry remaining. And so, sometimes you find the tiniest little piece of something to try and build on. And it's like, well, we have those cabinets and there's a little bit of wood there. And so, I did a plan. Everyone was like saying, when are we getting the plans for Troy? When are we getting the plans for Troy? And it's like, well, I can only get so much done in my hotel room in the Vanderbilt, trying to sketch things, because I'm not digital. It's a confession. I'm not digital. I've drawn with a pencil for so long that I never learned how to do it on the computer. So me drawing things in pencil on one of those little tiny desks in a hotel room, and then sometimes not even being able to get to a scanner or anything, and then taking a photograph of the drawing and then emailing it to the art department. And fortunately, we had people who could take a little chicken scratch thing I did and then do this as a 3D thing. And I mean, it really was a little small for Bloomingdale's. So that's why some of the counters are tall and some of them are short, because we figure you need to create some visual obstruction so people can maybe think more is going on. So when we started building our cabinetry, that's how Bloomingdale started to shape up. And this is the only picture I have of it partially dressed. And as you can see, there's still somebody on the side installing something. You know, it was all about the idea that there were windows on two sides and we could see out into the square. And we were trying to optimize what we did. And so having this view of the outside world was invaluable to us. And this is the idea of you have to be able to look at something and say, could this be something else? So we were filming at Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, which is a wonderful property with I love conservators, I confess. And I bend the ear of everyone I meet at every property. And this woman, Kristen Silver, there is just so knowledgeable. And but sometimes we have a day and a half worth of work, and it's like, well, we can't afford to take all these trucks and move everybody to do something else for this afternoon. And so there was a stable that I thought, okay, well, the wood texture on the wall at least is the start of something. But this is what we started, which was going to be our publishing house. And these are our renderings of turning it into a publishing house. Now, one of the strange things is we needed people to come in and out, and of course they weren't in the city. So I had to create this vestibule in the corner in order to not see what was outside the building when they were coming in the door. So these are renderings. Again, our illustrator, Matt Sama, is amazing because people look at them all the time and say they're renderings. And then these are some pictures of the actual product when we finished. And, you know, it was really just the texture of the wood walls that made me think that we could start to build something around it. This is another one that had a strange genesis. Before we decided to put the publishing company at Lyndhurst, they were touring us on the grounds, and there's a separate detached bowling alley that I think was put in the late 1890s. And this is the bowling alley building. And I thought, I wonder if that could be the ferry landing. And so, you know, we added some platforms and it became the ferry landing. And when you have a crazy idea like that, it helps to have good illustrators standing by, because you need to convince people pretty quickly before they, you know, decide that this is going to be the plan. And okay, we're going to build 2 days shooting here because, you know, we can do this ferry landing. But unless you can show them, you know, most people aren't looking at this and saying, oh, you're right, it's perfect ferry landing. And then they left the ferry in New Jersey, and then they had to land in New York. And so I kept saying to Lori Pitkus, our brilliant location manager, that could we find a building that had 3 sides or a courtyard kind of situation, so that we were shooting into buildings instead of shooting off into space. And I don't have the finished product, but these were the renderings showing of how to turn it into the ferry landing. Fortunately, they landed in the rainstorm because that helped obscure things. And so that's another rendering of how this worked out. And I don't have the final pictures. And am I actually out of slides already? I think I am.
That's it, Bob. I'm sure we have a lot of questions for Bob Shaw. So if you would like, oh, was that a little echo? Pardon me. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll be happy to bring the mic around. First over here. You're kind of deep, so we might have to pass.
Excellent talk. So you're dealing with some of these very large and houses. Did you have a particular issue with, set design for sound or lighting that, made you get rid of a location that you would have otherwise would have liked to use?
In this case, we often lose locations because of sound. If we're going to be in New York City, there are some places that are absolutely wonderful, but if it's on the truck route, we can't film there because the sound is too much of a problem. Locations are vetoed by the director of photography more often when they're outside, because I'll find something and I'll say, this is really great. And then go on a scout and show the director of photography and he'll say, well, this is going to be front lit. And, we're supposed to film this in the morning and it's going to be complete harsh sunlight. So we can't film here because I can't control the lighting. It doesn't happen as much inside. What happens on this show all the time is it's like they're waiting for some miracle and we're not in New York and we're in Newport and we're saying that it's New York. And they're saying, what's going to be outside the window? And like, we're going to put shears on the windows. And we're grateful every day for the amount of lace that was used in the period, because it looks great on the windows and it keeps you from seeing outside. When I came here today, Bill Pelletier asked me, like, how come we've never filmed here? And I said, the ballroom of Rosecliff comes up all the time. When we were in the first season, we were playing Newport mostly as being part of New York City. And I said, with the windows on both sides of the room, unfortunately, we're kind of like dead in the water. And I believe it's the title credits. Yeah, the title credits. Yeah.
The ceiling
So-
above you. If you look up here.
Oh, yeah. I've seen my name floating in front of that. Yeah, so I forgot, it did make it into the show, but they would bring it up all the time. And and the front I forgot. And actually I try not to read things that people write online. And like I said, if you're looking for inaccuracies, they're there. I'm sorry. And we needed to film a scene in the front of a character, Mrs. Chamberlain's house. And at one point we said, well, the thing that looks the most like a New York townhouse is the front of Rosecliff. So we filmed just the front of Rosecliff, and then we did a computer extension of the rest of the building. And someone wrote on a website somewhere, well, anyone could tell that they just like stretched the front of Rosecliff. And so that comes back to my father, and do they think we're idiots? But I thought it worked pretty well. And yeah, it solved the problem. I thought when they were saying, all the time they'll say, we need to find this and it needs to be near this. We have a studio in Queens. And they said, well, we've scheduled the publishing company on one of the stage days in Queens. And it's a very industrial area. And it would be good if it was a push cart move, which means that we just have to roll the equipment there and not move the trucks. And it's like, I'm supposed to find an 1882 publishing company in a warehouse district of Queens, which we ended up not doing, but these things happen all the time. And somehow puzzle pieces, and we were getting toward the end of the season, of the front of this mansion, it just, the roll of the dice, it fell in Newport. And, fortunately, we came up with the idea of using the front of this building. It wasn't a natural.
Here, I'll bring the microphone up to you. 1 minute.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Two things. One, where is the set? Where's the physical large set? And the other question is, how confident were you that you were going to get a second season out of this with such a big budget?
I was pretty confident that with the expenditure for doing the first season that they were going to do a second season. And I mean, I've done a lot of work with HBO and I'm familiar with a lot of their different shows. And when they did Rome, for example, It was a given that they were going to do at least 2 seasons because they couldn't, amortize it over less, So I was pretty sure, but you're never totally sure.
And then where there was the set.
Oh, right. The sets are all over the place. Our office is in Brooklyn. The Brook house is in Glendale, Queens. The back lot is in Bethpage, Long Island. The Russell House is in Glen Cove, Long Island. And then, of course, we're also filming in Troy, and we also film in Newport. And I live driving around listening to audible.com. And this season, just listening to audible.com, I made it through all 7 volumes of Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, which is, I think, 98 hours. But I was out of Proust when I drove here from Troy this morning, so I had to drive without him.
Any other questions? Well, Bob, thank you so very much. And a special shout out to Bob's brother, who we know is on Zoom right now. So thank you for sharing your brother with us. You did a wonderful job. Thank you all so much for your support of our lecture program. As Trudy said, this is our final lecture of the summer season, but we will be back in the fall. So please be sure to tune in. We'll be doing Gilded Age and Transportation. So look forward to seeing you in October. And again, thank you. Enjoy the reception.